I'm very glad to have Jason with us today. And thank you, man, for coming. And I guess I'm going to start with a very simple question, which is, well, how did it all start?
It started with a realization that the video camera was a tool for immortality. And that realization came about at around the same time in which I realized that we were mortal. So it was like the first thing that I jumped at as an antidote to the terrifying realization of what it means to be a finite being. I think that's the end of childhood, is the moment you learn about death.
For you, did it come at what age?
Well, let's see. My first video camera, if I watch those old clips of that, the camera where I was actively recording with was, I guess, 1993. And I was born in 82. So I guess like 11, 12 years old, where that existential realization became real. And then the magic of the camera to control time and to capture time and to immortalize that which is fleeting. And you could argue that the very beginnings of what eventually became Shots of Awe was simply, again, the creative power of being able to capture time, to capture ephemerality. And I found that tremendously fulfilling right away. Even though all the videos that I used to do when I was little, I was behind the camera. I wanted to be the director. I wanted to be like a filmmaker by definition. And it wasn't until maybe high school, when I was like 15, 16, that I started hosting these salons with my closest friends in my house, like in the terrace of my house in Caracas, Venezuela.
More or less like this one.
Yeah, very much so. And it was full of my mom's art, because my mom is an artist and a sculptor and a teacher and a poet. And so I was surrounded by her art, and we used to host these salons. And, you know, we'd get together Friday night and smoke some weed and get in the zone. And in the haze of that inevitable hilarity, in the haze of those giggles and those evocative contemplations that emerged in those gatherings with my friends, the kind of urge to record the conversations that were transpiring emerged as well. And what would happen is that we would evoke such a reverie, like me with my friends. The conversations took us out of time. And I would characterize myself as slightly neurotic. And so neurotic people, we spend a lot of time in our heads. It's hard for us to be present because we're always kind of pre-assessing what's going to happen and or stuck in the past. And in those conversations with my friends, I found a lot of freedom and a lot of presence that was rare. And some part of me, even though when you're fully in the present, you're not supposed to record it because you're supposed to be in the present. Put down the goddamn camera, right? But for me, somehow, some part of me was like, you know what? To record this, record what's happening. And it was upon the playback of that I had another big aha moment, which was seeing myself when I was not in myself. So the word ecstasy means to be beside yourself. And people often say, you know, the only thing getting in your way is you, and you want to aim to transcend yourself, or a flow state offers freedom from the inner chatter, all those things. And it was something about the playback of the footage of those evocative conversations with my friends and witnessing myself later in a state of no mind that I was like, oh, wow, like I can hold conversation. I have a natural expressive body language. Like I didn't recognize that person because I was such an introvert. And so that immediately was like, oh shit, like this is fun. Like, you know.
So even before you went to study film, you already had found out that you could use technology to enhance your better moments.
Yeah. And this, I've come to realize this later. So there's a guy, his last name is Cooley, and he developed this theory of how personhood emerges. It's called the looking glass self. And basically it has to do with the fact that our sense of self emerges in the feedback loops with other people and through the mirroring that takes place when we interact with others. And there's a famous line that it's like a play on words, but it says, you know, I am not who I think I am, and I am not who you think I am, but I am who I think you think I am. So we make a mental model of another person, right? I infer your mental states. And then I also make a model of what I imagine your model of me is. And then I try to live up to that. That's how we connect with people. Am I being who I think you think I am? Or am I improving the model that I think you have of me, you know? And I did that to myself with the videos, because the witness in the video was that other person. It was that objective perspective. And then evoking a flow state or evoking those interesting contemplations and those conversations with friends. In that reverie, in that ecstasy, in that philosophizing, right? In that thinking out loud, I found freedom from self. And in the recording and playback later, the neurotic me found comfort in seeing that the me that was loose and free and creative didn't need the neurotic me to do his thing.
Man, I think this is very interesting, because one of the main things with neurosis is you cannot hold in your consciousness your interior version and your exterior version. And you did that being very intense inside and then watching yourself being intense.
Yeah, it was like an interesting hack for me, because anybody who is introverted is probably aware or familiar with what it's like to be extremely self-conscious. You're just so stuck in your head, you know. You're the guy that doesn't dance at parties because he's so concerned about how ridiculous he's going to look. And so, you know, I still don't really dance at parties, but I found my dance, and I found a dance that upon later reflection, I was able to trust myself to perform, to do. And so just like a surfer who discovers his love of losing himself in the surf, or a piano player who, you know, after 10,000 hours of practice can just get out of his own way. That was the beginning of like, okay, I am going to create contexts in which I can transcend the perception of the passing of time. So immortality now, the eternity in the moment, you know, the world in a grain of sand, heaven in a wildflower, infinity in the palm of your hand, eternity in an hour. I figured out the precursors, the preconditions to evoke those altered states of consciousness, those poetic, liminal, mythopoetic trances that poets go into, that artists go into, that filmmakers go into. I figured out how to create the conditions for that. And then like a flame, those states of consciousness would emerge. And then I figured out a way of capturing that. So I evoked the timeless, I like to think, but then I have a tool that can capture the timeless and bring it back into time. So then those videos themselves were windows, were portals into the timeless. So then I became obsessed with that, with capturing liminal states, with capturing mythopoetic states, with capturing ineffable states. Because isn't that what we're always told about the greatest states of consciousness that human beings are privy to, those spiritual transcendental realms of the psyche? You know, they say, oh, you can't put it into words. It's ineffable. You can't language those experiences. They belong to God. And I'm like, okay, fuck it. So we're like Prometheus. We're stealing fire from the gods. Like I made it a personal challenge. It became an obsession for me to find ways of languaging ineffable states, the interior states that language normally doesn't do justice to. I wanted to do justice to, and I'm not the only person who does this. Any artist, musician, painter, or poet is using the tools at his disposal to communicate that which is beyond all tools. And that's a fun game, right?
So you just found a way of keeping the best energy moments of your adolescence. And in a sense, after that, when you went to school, you just read about the theories that explained those moments, but you kept them.
Yes. So, I'm probably butchering the quote, but there's that whole idea of choosing to hold on to childish things. Mm-hmm. That most of us, as we become adults, we surrender and we let go of our childish aspirations, those youthful endeavors, those states of mind, those endless summers that characterize our childhood before, the sobering realities of adulthood and finitude cloud our dreams. And I just remember that the purity and the ecstasy of those states of being in which I found a reconnection with that endless summer vibe, and in which I found freedom from the now imposing constraint of time passing. I was like, no. These portals, these states of consciousness are my salvation. I don't want to grow up if growing up means growing old and dying, or even dying before you die.
The intensity of those moments.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, my buddy Jamie Wheel, who co-wrote Stealing Fire, he calls these moments the remembering of the forgetting. So it's like,
very nice.
Yeah, amnesis is the word. So you forget that you forgot, and therefore you remember. Yeah, you remember, and so you're a child again. You're eternal again. You're divine again. Not because it says so in a book, not because someone else tells you you are, but because you know it implicitly. I think the word is maybe like catalepsis, which means a truth from which nothing can dislodge us. That's when the knowing comes from within. Catalepsis is a word that I came across that described this, and I guess it's the Greek word for a truth from which nothing can dislodge us. And I would argue that so much of the human experience, so much of human truth, the truth of mythology, the truth of poetry, is this truth that is cataleptic, a truth from which nothing can dislodge us, that comes from within. It's the truth of direct experience. It's the truth of felt experience. It's the realm of poetic facts.
So in a sense, you became a kind of epiphany reporter.
Yeah.
That's why the shots of are also called shots of philosophical espresso.
That's right.
But do you want to wake people up doing them?
Yeah, there's a documentary that I was obsessed with many years ago about the work of Ernest Becker. For those that don't know, Ernest Becker wrote The Denial of Death. It was a Pulitzer Prize winning book from the 70s about the human condition, and essentially about how our unique kind of consciousness, the level of self-awareness that we have, allows us to travel in time and project ourselves into the future, something most animals cannot do. Animals cannot do, and somehow we can. But with the gift of projecting ourselves into the future and being able to plan and design and imagine and create, also comes the capacity to project ourselves into the future and see that we grow old and die. And so the book basically says that that's the crux of the human condition. It's like, well, once you've fulfilled your basic needs for food and for shelter and for family, that's when you get like really existentially depressed, because now you have to fight for meaning in the face of death, which is very hard. And so that's what The Denial of Death is about. And this documentary, Flight from Death, looked at his work. And I remember the production company was called Transcendental Media, and their log line was to agitate the sleep of mankind. And this was like 2008 that I was like obsessed with this film. So that's over 10 years ago. And since then, that line struck with me. I was like, oh yeah, that's what I want to do. Or that's what I want my videos to do, hopefully at their best when they work, to agitate the sleep of mankind.
You know, one thing I've been doing, watching one of your videos each morning before starting work.
Beautiful.
It makes a difference.
Does it make a difference?
Yeah. You're almost a kind of human Starbucks. I mean,
Nice.
yeah.
Well,
it really works.
I used to call my videos shots of philosophical espresso, and then we went with shots of awe because it was just snappier. But in a way, like philosophical espresso was what it was, right? Because it's a condensed and compressed version of a philosophical download, a profound epiphany, hopefully, right? Because I never recorded myself unless I was actually having an experience, a profound experience. My videos were a response to something happening inside of me. And Terence McKenna, the psychedelic philosopher, you know, he writes and he spoke a lot about psychedelic experiences, experiences in which you find yourself in a realm beyond the bounded self. And I think Timothy Leary referred to these moments as exhilarating neurostorms of intense intellectual pleasure. Tim Doody says in these moments, you recontextualize the self and you see your sense of self instead as a marvelous conduit in a timeless whole from which molecules and meanings flow from neurons to nebula and back again. In other words, moments in which you become one with the cosmos, you know? And McKenna said that in these moments, they demand a response. In much the same way that getting slapped in the face demands a response. You can be like a calm person or not a very expressive person, but if somebody comes up and smacks you over the face, you're going to respond. Yeah. And these experiences demand a response. So for me, making the videos, capturing these moments, capturing these truth bombs, these philosophical espresso, I decided very quickly, I was like, oh, I can't plan what I'm going to say, nor can I outline, nor can I write a script or anything like that, because that would rob the videos of their authenticity. Because what I actually want to capture is more than what I'm saying. What I want to capture is a state of consciousness. And in order to capture a state of consciousness, I have to evoke a state of consciousness. So the closest thing to outlining what I was going to make videos about was in creating the initial conditions to evoke an altered state of consciousness, a state of no mind, a state of flow, and then trust what would emerge, and then record the response, which I couldn't help, right? Because the experience demands a response.
And then watch yourself recorded and think about the next time and preparing for the next time. Because what fascinates me more is the experiment, the whole experiment you're doing with yourself. Because you're just ingesting a very condensed, compressed version of yourself at your most intense moments. So you're becoming a very condensed version of yourself. You're curating yourself all the time.
Well, that's very interesting because, in physics, a singularity is what happens when you go through a black hole. And one of the aspects of black holes that have captured our imagination is just the idea that the laws of physics, as we know them, get real weird inside of black holes. And I would argue that any epiphany that we have that occurs outside of time is such a compressed experience that it's like a singularity. And the laws of physics, the laws of awareness, the laws of perception get real weird in those altered states. So to evoke those altered states, to then capture my response to those altered states while in those altered states, and then watch the playback of the videos in those altered states, creates a very interesting feedback loop of self-mirroring. And Douglas Hofstadter, in his book Gödel Escher Bach, speculates about how consciousness emerged. And because, the consciousness is such a mystery, but his analogy for what consciousness is and how it emerged applied to what I'm doing.
Yeah, the feedback loop.
The question that it creates is, what am I doing to my consciousness? Because he says basically that our brains are hard drives. They're like media that store patterns, right? That store data. And that data mirrors the world. So we map the world, and then we mirror the world, and then we store in our brain a map, a mirror of that world. So we have these models. These brains are media that store models of the world, right? But the more accurate that picture in the brain of the world is, right? The more dense with data it is, eventually that model of the world that you're making in your brain includes you as a member of that world. right? So you're making a model of the world, but that world includes you in it. So you see, that's where the camera flips on itself and looks at itself. And his words were that in that inevitable vortex of self-mirroring is where a real causal I, or a sentient self, emerges. And that's something that we're all doing. But to a certain degree, you could argue that the amount of granularity that exists there, the amount of self-mirroring, would determine the amount of consciousness that a species or entity has. So I imagine that, dogs are somewhat self-aware, but there's less self-mirroring happening. Humans are at this level. And then humans that do a lot of self-inquiry, you could argue that they're creating more self-mirroring and making that granularity deeper, and perhaps piercing modes of self-reflection that are more profound. I don't want to, assume that I'm, make the claim that I'm doing that, but it's an interesting speculation.
Yeah, because you see, what you do is very original. Normally, the traditional path to liberation, to enlightenment, means to undo yourself, your personality, or everything that really refers to what you are different from the other persons. But what you do is just the opposite. You intensify yourself in your difference, in your personality, to such a degree that perhaps you arrive at a certain level similar to those levels, but from the other perspective.
Mm-hmm. Well, see, based on what you said, yeah, and one way of spinning the whole enterprise from a psychoanalytic perspective is, holy shit, this is a very, 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 very creative and sophisticated, but ultimately narcissistic way of denying your own mortality and trying to cement your own specialness before the imaginary gods. So it's an immortality project, trying to convince the forces that I can't see that I am sufficiently unique to deserve a hall pass that frees me from mortality. I can see the way that could be a portrayal of what I'm doing, that it's ultimately a narcissistic project. Having said that, however, that doesn't take into account the hundreds of thousands and potentially millions of people who have become enriched by my content. So you could argue that any musician or any painter who creates work and then looks at his own work and then sells and shares and is validated by his own work is doing something very similar to what I'm doing. But if their work ultimately enriches others, then I think it's okay. And if in the end everyone dies anyway, the only response to the human condition, well, there's two choices. Either accept death with equanimity and grace, which Buddhism tells us, or find an immortality project that injects your life with enough meaning so that you can live with enough intensity that, as Bukowski said, death will tremble to take you. And just, live like that for as long as you can.
But you see, if that all were just a strategy not to change, then I would suspect something like narcissism. But you change a lot. This is what fascinates me. As you always say, please, you can explain this much better than I do. What you design you.
Yeah.
You change with your whole process. You're not the same person you were when you started. You just intensified yourself, but you changed during the process.
Because because in a way the intensification of the self structure is itself a modification of the self structure, and a refinement of the self structure, and a carving at the self structure to sharpen it and become is inevitably something different, sharper, broader, more articulate, more evocative, more sensitive, maybe. So in a way, you could call the enterprise of making art the art of cultivating yourself, right? And if you share the process, then you're also cultivating others by extension, by making it public. That is a very interesting thing. Although I would definitely acknowledge that there are aspects of my personality that cling to my basic essence. You can go back to conversations I had in high school where I said that aspects of my essence I was unwilling to give up. I was unwilling to cede to time. In a way, there was like just a fierce loyalty to my basic values and my basic loves. The things that defined what I was about were things that I wanted to live into, and I wanted consistency. So there is definitely an aspect that I was like, this core doesn't get to change.
Yeah, but at the same time, the end result of almost all your musings and videos is the moment of very intense awe. And all, isn't it the moment when you dissolve into the immensity of the external world, and you're not yourself any longer, and you're just part of the whole universe? How do you see it?
Yeah, I mean, definitely.
Is it not a way to forget everything?
Well,
all your pains, all your limitations?
It's a way of forgetting your limitations or realizing that you don't have limitations, right? One or the other. But yeah, I think it was just the capacity to experience that realm of the timeless. Because all too often, the tick-tock, tick-tock, tick-tock of Chronos, is it? It's an existential bummer, right? Like my parents getting older, like that sucks. You know what I mean? Or looking at pictures of 10, 20 years ago, that is a weird trip. Like, where'd it go? To hear my 90-year-old grandma say like, Jason, you just don't know. I feel like it was yesterday. Where did the time go? You know, and she's talking about 70 or 80 years. Like, you know, most of us hear our grandparents say that and we just kind of smile reassuringly, pat them on the back and change the subject quickly. But for me, those conversations always just leave a little faint disquiet because I imagine or I infer her mental state in that moment to say something in a moment of contemplation and to be like, where did the time go? What it must be like to be 90 and ask yourself where the time went. I can't imagine the strangeness. And I have compassion for that. But yeah.
What strikes me today in our conversation is how time is the protagonist of everything. And it's interesting because I think you are a kind of sculptor of time. And for me, you're revolutionary because I guess you found a way to present philosophy and philosophical ideas in a very contemporary way. And this brings me to a very specific question. You're obviously a very well-read person, but I guess you're revolutionary because you explain these things in a video format. So people who don't have time to read and ponder on these questions and so can absorb them through you, through your energy and through your person. So what do you think is going to happen? Perhaps the Jasons of the future are just going to quote you instead of the books you quote.
Yeah, wow. Thank you for that. I love that you use the phrase sculpting in time. I think it was Tarkovsky, the filmmaker, who described cinema as a kind of sculpting in time. And I love movies more than any other art form. And I love all art. But like, when you're in a movie theater, you know, and it's the right film and you're in the right state of consciousness, you're just the right amount of receptive and open, and your inner chatter is quiet enough that you can assume the viewpoint of the character quickly. You can make what they call the dietetic shift, where you're no longer seeing things through your point of view, but you've assumed the viewpoint of the character. You're no longer looking at the screen. You're now looking into the screen and out through the character's eyes into the character's world. That experience of radical decentering, of radical empathy, of radical becoming someone else, and that someone else being the archetype for everyone else, because the character in the film is not just you, he's everybody else in the audience, and she's everybody else in the audience. And that in 2 hours of Chronos, which is the average running time of a film, you can experience a lifetime of transformation in Kairos, which is subjective time, makes cinema what I think is a metaphysical portal to dimensions of the human experience that hint at divinations beyond measure. And as Ursula Le Guin said, science describes accurately from the outside. So that would be, yeah, cinema is 24 frames per second. It's a 2-hour running time of the story. It's edited like this. You know, science describes accurately from the outside. But poetry describes accurately from the inside, right? Science explicates, poetry implicates. Both celebrate what they describe. So the interior experience of watching a movie, of losing yourself and becoming immersed in a piece of media that carries you away to a place beyond death, right? Through the looking glass, into the mythopoetic realm, into the liminal space, into the threshold space, into the in-between space, you know? That realm of light, right? Because the original celluloid works by shining light through it, you know? Makes cinema the most magical thing in the world, like proof that we are greater than we know, you know? And so for you to describe Shots of Awe as sculpting in time, I'm flattered, because I always wanted to be a filmmaker for that reason. I wanted to weave that wand. I wanted to be a sorcerer of cinema. But I think I lacked the discipline and the wherewithal to work on a 2-hour motion picture and to manage 300 people in a crew and to go through the arduous process of what it takes to make an actual feature film. I bow down before those that do that. So I thought, well, I have the technology to maybe make something transcendent in 3 minutes, but less steps to get there, you know? But the fact that you find it a form of sculpting in time is very generous of you to say. Thank you.
Come on, you make poetry for yourself, for your own enjoyment to begin with, and I think one of the main messages is you can do this. Each and every one of us can do this, to make poetry. And poetry, as the Greeks used to say, it's poieni, is simply to make things up, and so it's like magic, and you create your own reality and your experience, and you curate that, and you live that, and because you live in the maps of your own creation, as everyone.
For sure. I mean, Ernest Becker in Denial of Death says that the entire personality structure is essentially a house of cards. The whole substructure of being, identity, the whole thing is ultimately an illusion, a virtual reality, a story, a narrative, right? A story you tell yourself about yourself that hopefully serves you and orients you in the world in a way that allows you to persist. And so Becker, in Denial of Death, argues that we have to sustain this narrative either through religious affiliation or cultural affiliation or romantic love and being mirrored by that person who approves of you and validates you through the movies that you associate with and so on and so forth. But he says ultimately this is a fragile illusion. And I would argue that, like a dream, you know, dreams could be described as illusions, virtual realities could be described as illusions, but this guy called Rich Doyle, he wrote in his book Darwin's Pharmacy, he said, dreams do not lack reality, for they are real patterns of information. So it's like, when people say, yeah, well, the self is a house of cards and the self is an illusion and you're only one bad day from going crazy, it may be that the self is sustained by mechanistic realities, right? It's sustained by a mortal body, and it's sustained by a body that needs to eat and sleep and so on and so forth. You have to take care of the machinery that runs the celluloid, that runs the movie. But the movie's real, man. It may not be made of flesh, right? The body's made of flesh, the movie's not, but the movie's real. It's
now
a real
disclosure. You're a Platonist. I didn't know that. You believe in a realm outside of ourselves at the end.
I guess so.
Because
live therapy. Right,
because you mention neuroscience all the time and dopamine and the workings of the brain, but you admit that there's something else. In a way, at least in our experience.
I do, but I just haven't seen a way of inhabiting or dwelling in that something else without running the machinery of the physical mortal body.
Yeah.
So if I'm in the movie theater, I
Totally
can having a transcendental experience, but if the power goes out or if somebody turns on their cell phone or if the movie projector fails, the dream will collapse, like they say in Inception. And in much the same way, the self-structure that runs in the mind that we can author and or create and evolve and steward is running on, you know, heart pumping, breath gasping, decaying bodies. This is the conundrum, is that we are gods and we are worms, or as Ernest Becker says, gods with anuses.
Mm-hmm,
you know?
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And so, fuck, you know, like, fuck.
So,
Like, I think, yeah, I just, that's the problem. So
yeah,
it's like,
that's also meditation that you developed to use using technology and philosophy and your own ruminations to pierce the veil and get out of the matrix, isn't it?
Yes, yes, yes. I have moments of eternity inside of parentheses.
Love that.
Parenthetical eternities. So, yeah, I can stage a moment that unfolds in a Euclidean meat space universe. And in preparation for that, I have to take care of a physical body. I have to sleep. You got to wake up and exercise, have some food, drink some coffee, make sure the blood sugar is all good. And then I have a window inside that parentheses where I know the machinery will sustain reveries in the Platonic realm until I have to pee, until I get thirsty, until I get tired. Oh, I have to leave the movie in the middle of the movie to go pee. Fuck, don't you hate that? When you're watching the best movie ever and then you're like, oh my God, biology beckons, I have to go pee.
Bad sculpting of time.
Bad sculpting of time. But yeah, I think there was this wonderful article called The Death of Awe in the Age of Awesome. And this guy, Henry Wisemeyer, said, experience is the new faith. And we are refugees from the mundane. And I don't think there's nothing new there, but he was trying to express it as something new in our contemporary world, because maybe traditional religion is not as appealing to highly educated people. And there's this kind of general malaise and discontent and jadedness about the state of things. And so now what people crave is visceral and intense experiences. We're in the experience economy. Throw yourself off an airplane, fly to South Africa to go on safari, go drink 3 bottles of ayahuasca so that you can have an experiential encounter with the numinous. So experience is the new faith. It's the new thing that we bow down before. It's not before the gods, but it's before an experience, a willingness to submit to new experiences, right? Because if you cannot submit, you cannot die. Metaphorically speaking, of course. And if you cannot die, you cannot be reborn. And what we're all looking for ultimately every day is resurrection. Jamie Wheel calls it the bliss fuck crucifixion, you know? And yeah, I forgot where I was going with that. But
to many places is also
many places.
To many places. But you see, I love it when you say that religion is not the best solution any longer. Not even romantic love, even if I'm very fond of it. But creativity is the better solution.
Yeah, and I think that we could borrow from religion into our creative pursuits. You know, I mean, fuck, if somebody like gave me access to a Gothic cathedral and allowed me to invite a highly curated group of people and install like crazy Hans Zimmer music and give everybody a bunch of marijuana vape pens, and then like we could really evoke some religious reverie. You could call it spirituality without religion. There doesn't need to be dogma, just a couple of rules to create the magic circle. You know, in game theory, they talk about this. And experience design is this new science that is now becoming really popular, which is the art of experience design, of designing and crafting interior experiences. So using external triggers to evoke interior states, right? Eric Davis, who wrote Technosis, says that our understanding of the neurochemistry of lived experience and the effect of architecture, music, and all these things to mediate consciousness allows us to directly engage the technical material of subjectivity itself. So now it basically gives us authorship and stewardship of internal life, something we couldn't do before. You know, you could argue, okay, go to a concert, it's going to be fun. It's not necessarily going to be fun. It's only going to be fun if you're open and you respond to the environment. If you don't respond to the environment, it's not going to work. But the better we get at hacking ourselves, at DJing our neurological response to stimuli, then we start getting better at being able to DJ our own experience, our own interiority. So we move into a world of like designer realities. So it's not just like one religion for all, but it's like 1,000 different video game religions. Pick your preference, you know, pick your truth.
So curation of experiences is the key to creativity in a sense.
Well, creativity, but also that will be the outlet that we turn to for salvation from our rumination and despair. It's like ecstasies for everybody, like democratizing the portals for ecstatic experiences and bringing 1,000 different options instead of just one. You know, go to Burning Man if you really want to see what the future of experience design looks like. I mean, people think, oh, Burning Man is a music festival. It's not a music festival. It's a theater of the absurd constructed from scratch for 1 week that is self-selecting because it's so hard to get there. And Eric Davis described it as millions of pocket universes collapsing on a parched void. So it's like, it's worlds inside of worlds with worlds inside of worlds, and it's just an unbelievable place. And I think it's also a glimpse of like where we're heading in terms of our new Jerusalem. One of the paradoxical things that happens at Burning Man is you have 70,000 people experiencing a choose your own adventure, because every choice sends everybody tumbling down a different rabbit hole, and it's like just unbelievable what transpires. And the permutations and combinations of experiences that each consciousness is having is like beyond measure. This guy called David Lenson had this great description of consciousness. He says consciousness is a collaboration between subject and object. And so it's kind of an equation to describe the interior state or the interior experience of a person. He said it's person multiplied by place multiplied by time, which reveals a Borges-esque garden of forking paths of possible conscious experiences. So you have millions of those happening at Burning Man, and yet all of them lead to the same place. So it's 1,000 roads to God, because at the end, everybody watches the man burn together, and it actually becomes a communal ecstasis experience. Mm-hmm. My friend Jamie Wheel, who wrote Stealing Fire, has this wonderful trifecta. And he says it's first is ecstasis, so the initial experience of freedom from self, freedom from inner chatter, freedom from neurosis, freedom from second guessing, freedom from fear, freedom from self. That's ecstasis. That's followed then by catharsis. Catharsis is where the cognitive dissonance heals, where the tears are shed, where revelation is felt. I mean, that's where the healing happens. So you have ecstasis followed by catharsis. And then the last one is communitas. Mm-hmm. On the other side of catharsis, on the other side of those tears, you break the isolation. And now you have a common experience with everyone else. We can all mend to our brokenness together and walk each other home, as Jamie Wheel would say. And look, I get goosebumps just saying it.
So the greatest work of art is the work of art of your own life, but the very greatest work of art is our life together.
Yeah, both of them. Yeah, I mean, the dance goes together, man. It's like the end of the documentary Flight from Death. The narration was a quote by Jean-Paul Sartre. It says, "Everything has been figured out except how to live." And then the next line, he says, "So perhaps the better question is not what are we to do with death, but what are we to do with life? Life exists in individual moments, and it is up to us to make sure those moments are vital, interconnected, and grand, to make a masterpiece out of life, one that we would willingly live again and again for all of eternity. This is what we can strive for."
Mm-hmm. So in a sense, you're an existentialist, really, because it's about choices and choices and choices. And
Yeah, sure.
I'll using your freedom to choose.
Well, I used to call shots of awe, existential jazz. The jazz part, of course, is because jazz is an art form characterized by freestyle, free association, improvisation. And existential because all the themes are engaging with what it means to be a sentient being. You know, every Shots of Awe episode ultimately brings the subject at hand back to the question of what does it mean to be a thinking, breathing piece of defecating meat destined to die. And some might say, Sheldon Solomon said, ultimately no more significant than a lizard or a potato, you know, but Alan Harrington would say, well, having invented the gods, we can turn into them. So choose your platitude, you know, choose your truth, you know?
Yeah, because a potato doesn't invent its own technology, and we can do this.
That's right.
We invented the book, and we invented the camera, invented whatnot.
A potato doesn't write poetry, man. That reason alone is what makes me think that we're special.
It's reason enough to wake up in the morning.
Yeah. Yes.
You're very positive.
Amen.
Yeah, you're very positive in your message. But what do you think about the future? Are you positive regarding technology and its possibility of solving the problems itself it creates?
Yes. And the first side note is, of course, I'm aware that technologies create unintended consequences, for sure. But the solution to those unintended consequences is simply the deployment of better technology. We can't go backwards. We can only move forward. But the truth of the matter is that when we move past the rhetoric, science is the only news. Everything else is the same he says and she says. And science and technology is the only way we've ever actually solved problems. It's like that line from Dead Poets Society when Robin Williams is talking about poetry. And then he says, you know, science, technology, engineering, these are noble pursuits necessary to sustain life. But poetry is what we stay alive for. So we need both. And I want both, and I celebrate both. And most of the corporate talks I do are about exponentially emerging technologies, which are ultimately extensions and embodiments and literalizations of human creativity and will in the world, tools and instruments and technologies that literally, not just metaphorically, augment, extend, and overcome our limitations and allow us to work together, right? We may be flawed, stumbling primates, but when we work together, we are primates that can fly. We build aircrafts, we build cathedrals, we build smartphones, we speak to other minds across the planet. Collapsing geography, time, space, and distance are not limitations for us. Like, we are the music makers and the dreamers of dreams. It's just, we often don't have the consciousness to deploy these tools in the right way. Or many of us don't deploy these tools in the right way. Some people are going to spend their whole time eating junk food with technology, you know, consuming mindlessly and entering zombified trance states and whatever, to each his own. But the tools are there for us to make music, my friends, and we should celebrate that.
Can you imagine schools in the future focusing on teaching exactly this?
Well, we're trying. Some friends of mine have a startup called the Awe Academy, which is actually using a lot of Shots of Awe videos in their curriculum. And the whole aim of it is to bring the sensibilities of cosmological existentialism, awe, and wonder into the classroom. And so hopefully we'll have some success with that. So, yeah.
You mentioned technology, and at the same time, I think that your favorite technology is just language. I mean, you have a way with words, man. But funny thing, you're also from Venezuela. You speak Spanish. I imagine it was your mother tongue or not.
Yo crecí con los dos lenguajes. Nací en Caracas, soy venezolano. Bueno, mentira, soy doble ciudadano porque la familia de mi mamá es americana. Mi abuela se mudó de Nueva York a Caracas cuando se casó con mi abuelo. Entonces mi madre nació en Venezuela, pero completamente bilingüe con mamá americana. Y mi papá sí es venezolano, y entonces yo me crié con los dos lenguajes at the same time. Elementary school fue una escuela Montessori in Spanish, but then 7th grade, I already switched to the American school. Pero at home, yeah, I mean, I was fully bilingual from day
From
one.
the beginning, from day one.
Sí, señor.
And you feel different when you switch languages. And you see the world differently when you switch languages.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of interesting articles and literature about that.
Get them. Tell us about your experience.
Well, I think that bilingualism actually makes you softer and stronger at the same time. By having two lenses through which you see the world, you get the benefit of knowing that there are lenses to begin with.
Yeah.
Because people who speak one language, they have one worldview and one perspective for the most part through which they perceive reality. Mm-hmm. And so when you only have one perspective, I mean, if you've worn glasses your whole life and never taken them off, you forget that you have glasses, or you never learned that you even have glasses, right? But when you grew up in Venezuela, Spanish and English, went to an international school with kids from all over the world, well, it was like Venezolano, Americano, Jewish, Catholic, Muslim, not Muslim, Nigerian, Indonesian. And in an environment in which you were taught to embrace and respect differences, right? Emphasizing kindness always. It just, I don't know. I think just eventually it makes you aware that there are lenses of perception. So it makes you you have more cognitive flexibility when assessing a situation because you can quickly and automatically see it from multiple perspectives. Mm-hmm. You have the sensibility of multiple audiences at once. Mm-hmm. And that's capacity to surf situations better. It gives you, again, a cognitive flexibility, a linguistic flexibility that is very advantageous. So in that sense, it makes you softer and stronger. Mm-hmm. Softer because you're more compassionate and empathetic to others. Mm-hmm. Stronger because you have more tools in your toolkit with which to solve and manage problems and your life and engage with others.
Mm-hmm. Do you think this emotional intensity you have the gist to convey, does it come from the South American toolkit?
Definitely. O sea, le digo en español porque creo que ustedes también entienden un poquito, pero en Venezuela, como en Brasil, nosotros hablamos con los brazos. O sea, la gente que ve mis videos que no saben que soy venezolano, cuando se enteran, when they find out I'm Venezuelan, they're like, I just met this Venezuelan girl. I was in Kauai in Hawaii, and there was a Venezuelan girl that lived there who was a fan of mine. And she was like, I used to watch your videos on Facebook. I knew you were Venezuelan even before I knew you were Venezuelan because of the arms. But for the average person, my largest audiences are in like New York and LA online. You know, they're not Venezuelan, so they just think, oh, he's so passionate how he moves his arms. I'm like, that's so normal where we come from, you know? But it's very funny, yeah, for sure.
They're just like, what you're drinking, man.
Exactly. I'll have what he's having.
Yeah.
What is he smoking, you know?
Yeah.
So funny.
Well, thanks a lot, Jason, for the conversation.
It's been lovely.